And welcome back after the break. I hope you've all had a good lunch. Our session this afternoon is focusing on comics in the classroom. And we have three speakers in this session. Helen Jones from UCL Institute of Education, Richard Ruddock, Year 6 teacher from Norwich, and Rich Charlesworth, Teaching Enhancement Lead for English at a school in Hounslow. You should appear on the screen. I hope somebody upset. Wonderful. What a miracle technology is when it works. Hello, everybody. Hello from Kendal. It's good to see you. All very clear. Well, everybody, please give a very warm Kendal welcome to our speakers.
Okay, hello. It's lovely to, as I say, it's lovely to be here. We're not here with you, but my name's Helen Jones, and thank you for having us here today on what's such a fantastic programme. As I said, it's a shame we're not here in real life at the Lakes, but I think it lends a sort of air of authenticity to our presentation on comics in the classroom, that both Richard Ruddock and Rich Charlesworth are actually both joining us from their schools this afternoon. So first of all, thank you to their schools for allowing them to have this time out of the classroom to actually talk to us about comics in the classroom. I'm just going to go to sharing my screen with you now so we can go through our slides. So just bear with me while I do that. And hopefully you should be able to see our slides up on the screen now. So when I was approached by LICAF to present at the festival, I automatically knew I wanted to share with you some of the brilliant and practical ways actually teachers are using comics both to augment the curriculum and develop children's literacy and develop children as comic makers. So in this presentation, I'm going to share with you some of my own research into children's comic clubs and comics making. And then Richard and Rich are going to share some of the innovative ways that they've been using comics in schools. Let's see, I can just make the slide share along, move along there. There we go. So I'm going to, as I said, look at exploring children's comic making and after school comics club. And I love this picture I took of one of the children's comics that they made when they were talking about themselves, and their special power is making comics. I think that sort of underlies the whole of my argument in the next sort of 5-10 minutes that I'm going to present to you. So my research, as I did, was based on children's comic making in an after-school comics club, and it was a large four form school, so about 120 children per year in South London. It was a small action research project that took place in 2019 and has subsequently become the pilot study for my PhD research into children's comic making. So why clubs? Why are clubs important? Clubs can offer children an important learning space, one that's not quite the formal environment of the classroom. And these can often be called affinity groups after the work of Paul Gee, because all of those coming to a club have a shared affinity in wanting to read and make and design comics, all to a certain level of involvement. So some children really wanted to lead on the whole production of the comics and publishing of comics. Others wanted to create the comic strips to go inside. Others just were there sort of wanting to learn and look what others were doing as well. And in a busy curriculum, clubs also offer space for children to develop as authors and comics creators and artists in their own right. So pulling on their own interests and ideas to create comic strips in an alternative space for learning, sort of somewhere outside of the classroom, but still a space where they're there to learn and to develop as comic makers. And the research took a project-based approach with the children working towards organising a comics fair and selling their comics. So the club was aimed at Year 5 children who are aged 9 to 10 years old. And in the end, 21 children took part in the club. The children had to apply for the club through an application form, and it was immediately oversubscribed. So a selection of children were picked. And as that quote shows you, there was lots of excitement about the club starting, and mainly because I found out the majority of the children who were coming to the club were already making comics at home. You know, it's a small sample of 21, but out of that 21, it was 81% of the children who were already making comics at home for their own enjoyment. And 3 of those children were what I would call prolific comic makers. So they were making series of comics, they were sharing them with family and friends. So the majority of the children who came to the club, or the whole of the children actually who came to the club, came with a hungry appetite to learn more about comics and work together on comics making. So what were some of the key findings from the research and the Comics Club project? Because participation in clubs is voluntary, the children who came had to come wanting to learn, and they needed to be able to share ideas and engage in the process of comics making. So, for example, one of the key standout moments was that the children did not really want to make comics when I told them what to include. You know, if I suggested the narrative or the content, they weren't really that interested, because they all actually knew what they wanted to make comics about. Therefore, much of the curriculum of the Comics Club was actually driven by the children themselves. What they wanted me to help them with were the technical aspects of comics making. So, for example, how to create speech bubbles at the right size, or how to use panels in a range of different ways. But in terms of narrative content, they all knew exactly what they wanted to create. Another key moment in the research was how the children worked collaboratively to create comics, and they worked in groups to put together a short comic to sell at the comics fair. They worked in groups of 4 to 5, and each group developed a firm identity around the types of comics they wanted to make. So, for example, the Catacorns had a very Japanese, kawaii or chibi aesthetic. The 4 Musketeers actually created their own superhero universe with 4 different superhero characters that all interacted. And then Dirt Wars, which is another one there you can see on the screen, they were really inspired by memes that they were looking at and enjoying online. So another thing as well, the children were really aware of their influences and how they had taken ideas from media and comics books they read, or the internet, as I said, with Dirt Wars, and they adapted or changed it for their own narratives and comic making. So they weren't copying narratives they'd read before, they were creating their own stories. And they also helped and supported each other to create the comics. And one thing that I really noticed was their characters often appeared in each other's comic strips as well. So they were interacting through the comics together. So as I mentioned earlier, a crucial element of the project was that the children had to organise and sell their comics at a comic fair. And they were selling these to the whole school. And this was both a rewarding and nerve-wracking experience for the children. They were very nervous about sharing their work with others. But for many of the children, it meant they were prepared to work hard on a piece of work that was presentable and understandable to anyone else reading it. They often worked outside the club hours to get their comics finished and published, sometimes to the last minute, sort of hovering over the photocopier. And they also created posters and advertised the event themselves. The comic fair itself took place after school, and all the school and the parents were invited. So as I said, it's a large full elementary school, you know, so this meant with the Key Stage 2 children and their parents, we were inviting around an audience of 600 people. And obviously 600 people didn't come, but a large number of them did. You know, one of the things that was so exciting for the children, that they all sold their comics and saw their comics being read by the rest of the school community. So as I sort of already started to mention, the outcomes of the fair for both the children and the audience were really positive. The children in the club reported feeling like pro-comic makers, and what they created inspired their peers as well. And in fact, at the fair, we had several pop-up or fringe comic sellers, as other children from other year groups also wanted to sell their comics that they'd made at home. Parents and actually teachers were also very engaged and were impressed by the range of narratives the children had produced, and liked the fact that many of the characters in the comics reflected the cultural backgrounds and heritage of the children who were part of the club. So at the end of the project, the children completed questionnaires about the club, and the feedback from the children replicates the observations that, you know, I had and the teachers involved in the club had made throughout the project. They particularly enjoyed the comics fair, so that aspect of selling and swapping, you know, was the most preferred thing that they'd enjoyed. They also really enjoyed the ownership of creating their own stories and the hands-on collaborative side of comics making and publishing. So my argument here is that you should all now think about going and running a school's comic club if you're a teacher, or think about how you can support children to have comics club in schools, or create comics fairs for children to sell and swap their work. I think there's 5 key things that need to be involved. So allowing children to create comics based on their own ideas and the stories they want to tell. Making sure children's voices can be heard through the own comics that they want to write and produce, and that children's comics reflect their backgrounds and their interests. So there's a high level of diversity amongst the children in the comics club, and because they were creating comic strips with characters that looked like themselves, they saw themselves being represented in the literature they were making. It helped the children to develop their confidence and self-belief that they can be successful comic creators with an audience who wants to buy their comics. And the whole project itself was very collaborative and was child-led approaches to learning. That last little quote there is, again, just an argument to think about why children making their own comics and reading comics that other children have produced is so important. It's the school receptionist a couple of days later who pulled me over to have a little bit of a moan with me. But I think the moan was a brilliant example of why children should be creating comics for us to read. So, a reason for being late to school was that they couldn't get out of bed because they were reading the comics they had from the school comic fair. So that's a little bit about comics clubs and children creating comics. I'm going to hand you over now to Richard Ruddock, who's going to be talking about how he's integrated comics into the curriculum.
Brilliant, thank you, Helen. So I'm going to focus on an ongoing project, really, about how to integrate comics into the curriculum and to make sure they're providing purpose and not there as a novelty item, and actually helping children develop with their learning. So I did a lot of work on making them a part of our reading culture. And then when we started to realize how popular they were and how children were really enjoying them, and it was helping readers of all abilities and all confidence levels and all different backgrounds, we started to think, could we tap into that and help their learning in the same way? So the first way I approached this was to use what I would call text marking. Other people have different names for it. And basically, it is the process of writing down your thoughts and your predictions and your questions as you go through a piece of text. So in the image, this is one from a Superman book that I did with Year 6 that involves him taking on the Klan. And it's very thought-provoking for that age, because you're starting to understand the concept of sort of racism and inequality. So it was really good to get them to start thinking about, why is this happening? Why would someone do that? Is there previous, and have all those tough discussions, but those important discussions. And as they go through, they annotate it with a partner, talking about it. What do they think is happening? Why do they think that might happen? There might be, they had a question in the first panel that's answered in the 6th panel. And then once you've given them time to do that, you then go through as a whole class or a whole group, if you're doing it in a small group, and you then hear other people's ideas and other people's thoughts, and you might have an answer to your question, or someone might have interpreted some vocabulary differently. And as you can see, there's blue pen on there as well as black. So the blue is what they've added in from that discussion after they've already put down their own thoughts. So it's a really good way of making them think about everything that's happening on there, what they're actually reading, sort of going beyond the words or going beyond the images, and trying to explore everything that's available on a page and take in everything that's there, rather than rushing through it and kind of trying to make it a mission to complete it as quickly as possible. And we did this once or twice, and we started to realize the children were really engaging well with this, and particularly those children who maybe found English a bit trickier or weren't as confident as others, I noticed were much more willing to have a go, because technically, it's just their thoughts. They might not be right about something, but I'm only asking them to predict or to try and ascertain. And you're almost discreetly developing some inference skills. You're developing that questioning method that you need. And we were getting a lot more success with that than just saying, here's 6 comprehension questions, please answer these in your book. We've all had the battle where it's, oh, this is a 2-mark answer, you've only put 3 words. And actually, I didn't have to mention that, because the children were just starting to explore and explain themselves in much greater detail. And it really helped, doing it with a Year 6 class, it really helped them improve their grasp and concept of reading and explaining what they were reading in a very short amount of time. And they enjoyed it. And that was the key thing. They loved doing the questions, doing the work in this way. And sometimes we might give them a couple of questions afterwards to answer. Sometimes we wouldn't, it depended what we felt, but they were much happier doing it that way and found it much more almost safe for them and provided them with it. They felt they had like, well, I've got this to refer to. And they loved it. And ever since then, it's been a really integral part of my teaching for a couple of years now. That's always been very popular. Next slide, please, Helen. So having seen it work, you've got another example here, but this one was looking at how I can use it to combine more than one subject. So the original way was just, we're going to do this in an English lesson. We're going to talk about it, and we're going to think about the English side of things. So vocabulary, could be punctuation. And then it was like, well, actually, I could probably do more than this with it. And the other page was a good example of this as well. So this one always sticks in my head as like the lesson where the penny dropped for me, and it proved to me and other people what I was doing was beneficial and not a novelty. So we use this page from The Incredible Hulk, and it's from World War Hulk, which I'd read just myself at the time. And as I was reading it, I sort of looked at the vocab and thought, oh, it'd be really good to maybe explore some of this language on this page. And I gave it to my class. And what I wasn't expecting was how we would end up in a very in-depth, detailed chat about mental health. We discussed supporting others who may have difficulties of varying degrees. So children felt comfortable saying they were dyslexic in the class at that point and sharing that they'd had that struggle. We had a girl who was autistic who was like, actually, I sometimes struggle, for people to understand what I really mean, or I struggle to sort of understand what other people are saying. And that's what causes a lot of my problems. And we ended up having about half an hour discussion about all these kind of really heavy topics that you'd maybe normally associate with PSHE, or even some people wouldn't ever discuss. They'd leave it to maybe someone going off for some pastoral time or something. And we were able to have it as a whole class. It was really sensibly and maturely handled. And the children all engaged and respected each other really, really clearly. And it actually helped solve some difficulties we were having at the time, because they sort of allowed each other to see what makes them vulnerable and realize none of us are free of any vulnerability. We've all got our concerns. And it was, it showed to me there's more than just let's help you get better at English skills. Actually, we can do that, but we can also do it and support you in other ways and other lessons. So the one on the page before as well gave us a really interesting discussion about racism and equality and making sure we're treating other people fairly. But this was the lesson, I say, where other teachers started to say, oh, it's not just Richard doing things with what he likes. Actually, he's got a point there, and this has a purpose. And again, the kids enjoyed it as well. Yes, we had a difficult conversation, but they enjoyed that space. They enjoyed that opportunity, and they felt safe there. So they were happy to engage with it, which was key. Next slide, please. So then I looked at the idea of, right, we need to make this regular, and we can't always just do text marking. We've got to make it purposeful. It's got to be fit for what we need. So that's one strand, but how can I support my children in a variety of ways? So last year, obviously we had a very disrupted year in the classroom. We had a disrupted year the year before. And, it wasn't as easy for some children to come back as others, or some found it was very different to what they'd known before, and they found that difficult to deal with. So as I was going through, I knew that I had a lot of children that loved the work of Raina Telgemeier, like adored it, and had already talked about how it had given them a bit of a voice, or they'd felt seen by reading her work because it was so relatable. So I decided, rather than, again, it wasn't an English lesson, but I thought actually, rather than just giving them something for the sake of it, I'm going to give them an opportunity to impart their own wisdom. So yes, they're doing English work, but actually it was all from their own voice and their own opinion. So what you can see on the screen is a double spread. There was another page before it, but this was the main one we were looking at. And it's looking at the idea of just, how do you get help? What do you do? Or what can you do when things are building up on you? You've got some anxiety, or you've got something troubling you, but you're not necessarily comfortable expressing yourself, or you're not sure what to do. So in the story, the character Raina goes to a therapist, but she's not really comfortable opening up. So I gave him a few simple questions. We looked at a bit of body language. So on one page, she's biting her nails. So we talked about the idea of, how do we know she's nervous? And for some of them, that was really tricky to work out. We had to look at the idea of you might bite your nails if you're nervous and so forth. But then we finished with the most important question, which was, what would you say? What advice would you give someone in this situation? How would you help a friend, or how would you help someone you never met who you could tell was struggling like this? And I think if we go on to the next slide, there should be some responses. Yeah, so we had a couple here. These weren't the only ones. These were just some of the ones that at the time really struck me as children who'd grasped it. Or one of them was a child who actually, I'll be 100% honest with you, did not have a very successful year in my classroom in terms of their English work. Like, they found it hard. They never produced, maybe we didn't get the best out of them. But this lesson, their advice was actually one of the best of the whole class. And a lot of the children kind of like, oh, wow, I didn't know, they were capable of that. And no longer was it a child who was trying to avoid work or, telling other people. It was someone who'd got their thoughts down and offered some fantastic advice. And I think the one, the top one's lovely because it talks about the idea of, someone else might actually have dealt with this that you don't know, because children always think they know everything, don't they? And they're well aware of everything that's going on. And someone actually said, maybe someone else has done it and you don't know, and they could help you. The middle one was just because the girl who wrote that really did overthink things, and she had to often say to herself, like, oh, I know I'm probably worrying about this, and it was her saying, actually, this is what I need to do as well. But the bottom one was the one to me that just really struck me as someone who just thought about it. And to describe it as though, so throughout life, you'll go through roller coasters of emotions, but you have to live life the way you want and don't let the little worries take over you, was just perfect. Because, it's a 10-year-old child actually saying, isn't all going to go to plan. That's okay. Try to focus on what's important to you and who you are. And we got all of that out of, 2 pages of a comic, which apparently isn't proper reading compared to for some people, or isn't justifiable. And I would never have done an English lesson any other time that would have allowed us to say that. But there we are having that discussion. So it really opened up the personal side and provided them that opportunity. And again, it was looking at multiple strands in one. It wasn't just 8 questions on whatever our topic was for the sake of it, so I could say tick, tick, tick. It was actually, here's some thought-provoking questions where I don't need 4 pages of answers, but what I need is for you to give me everything you know about this, or your full kind of opinion. So next slide, please, Helen. So moving forward, that's kind of where it was. Now, some of that was at a previous school. I've now moved on to a new school, and basically going to start trying to look at the idea of using some of this as a way to support children who may be disengaged with reading, as a way to support children who might struggle with some writing skills, or it could be they struggle with certain comprehension skills. And rather than doing like, here's an intervention, you're going to get better at this in time for SATs, we're going to run it as a small group where it's like, right, great, let's read some books together. Let's see what we like. And then we'll start working in a few activities. And it won't be onerous. It won't be, you need to get 6 out of 8 today. It will be those kind of questions where they share their voice, or it will be using a comic to develop. It could be they struggle with speech, year 3, year 4. Let's blank out something. Let's work on some speech. It could be they struggle with noun phrases. Let's identify the nouns on this comic strip. Let's start looking at how we can describe those using some of this powerful language. Whatever suits them is what it's going to need to be. Now, it's already started up. We've got a group of 10 children. The first session, some of them loved it. They were like, great comics. Some of them were like, I don't know how I feel about reading. But we're going to give them that chance to be, slowly given that chance to enjoy it, and hope that comics are actually going to break it down. And, the initial responses already suggest from the ones who don't like it, they find reading hard, or they find there's too many words on a page, or they don't have the chance at home to read, so they don't really like it. And we're trying to make it that kind of special thing. And the idea is, if this works and, we see how it goes and they enjoy it and it benefits them, it helps them improve in whatever aspect would like them to feel more confident with at school, it can actually become something that happens in every year. So it's a junior school for me. They can do it across every year, and they can do it for the way that suits them. So a year 3 child, it might just be helping them get into reading. But a year 6 child, it might be actually they really struggle to explain themselves. So let's do a little bit of work with this that helps you open up and do that. So it's hopefully going to provide a platform across the whole key stage, and it could be used in key stage 1, don't get me wrong, that can develop not only their skills, but a love of reading, broaden their understandings, and just give them an opportunity to explore more than they would at their current kind of rate. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. And I'll just hand you over to Rich Charlesworth.
No worries. Thank you. I'm obviously in school at the moment, so if there's any background noises, apologies. And just to sort of reiterate what Rich is saying, I think what's key from him not only is his passion, but knowledge of the text. It comes up a little within my presentation today, which focuses again within Key Stage 2, but it's knowing the text and knowing the right text to choose with that class or with that year group. So yeah, you can skip this slide. This is just a lovely intro. So this first part, I'm a full form entry in West Hounslow. So we've got just over 800 pupils. So I work across the whole Key Stage into EYFS early years and Key Stage 1, but spend half of my week in year 6. So a lot of the examples of the writing, which I've included, and the discussions that we've had within Year 6 reflect a really diverse range of different backgrounds, but also a range of different abilities as well. So we had sessions which we've put in as part of our guided reading. The approach that we've adopted, not across the whole school just yet, but especially within Key Stage 2, is with the whole class. We've been lucky enough to have a very proactive and a very supportive head teacher who values graphic novels. So we've been able to get, with it as part of our guided reading sort of budget, we've been able to get a text for each class. So they share about 16 copies. So we choose really specific text that we're going to look at. And what has been important for me is, because we're working it as part of our guided reading or literacy, is to kind of justify it with elements of the national curriculum. So it builds on really nicely from what Rich was saying just before. We obviously as well, just behind me is our school library, which I've worked really hard to get sort of really high quality text. And I'm pleased to note we've got a really lovely graphic novel section, which is continuing to not only be the most popular part, but to be invested in as well. Once you have the evidence, the head teacher's quite keen to kind of put more money into it to get children reading. Know Helen as part of our children's literature course at Goldsmiths, so we've both worked there. And the work that you'll see in this presentation is linked to the Sean Tan's The Arrival, which I know could be contentious as part of a graphic novel. It's kind of a hybrid graphic novel picture book, but the ideas and the things that I'll talk about related to that focus on the panels, the gutter, and I hope it justifies it being included as part of the comics and graphic novel discussion. And the second is with Macbeth, which we've traditionally done through Shakespeare, and last year decided to look at a visual element, including the graphic novel. And as this has been so popular and it's been sort of really engaging, we're rolling this out then from years 3 to 6, so including texts such as When Stars Are Scattered by Omar Mohammed and Victoria Jameson, and Arthur at the Golden Rope. Those are both year 5 and year 4 respectively. I feel very much like Boris, but next slide please, Helen. Thank you. So when we were reading The Arrival, those of you who know it's beautiful text by Sean Tan, but without words. There are a few written down, and Sean Tan's individualized language is present throughout, but it's very much a wordless book. So in terms of planning as a teacher and practitioner, I first started, I know it very well, but first started to look through the different parts and to find out parts not only in the narrative but within individual cells. So there'll be points in our discussions where there's a singular double page spread, which is usually across the both pages and large, and then there's also sequential panelled pages, which sometimes are in groups of 12, but the reading of that has been really interesting. For some sessions, we didn't have to have a written objective. Again, this sort of varies depending on the school that you're within, but some sessions were just discursive, so that the discussion or an illustrated response could also be used. Next slide, please, Helen. Thank you. So what was really important, there's sort of key skills that we have to teach as part of school curriculum and as part of it working within English. So inference, I think, for this lent itself so perfectly. The idea of reading between the lines, traditionally in terms of text, but reading between the images, obviously sort of the gutter within graphic novels and comics. There's so much meaning, and there's so much that children bring to that is really personal. I appreciate some of these are quite small, so I'll do my best to sort of paraphrase and pick out particular features. But when we talked about the gutter, it was really interesting to sort of to see the children's own responses. Ever since I've started teaching, I've used Aidan Chambers' Tell Me grids. So he focuses on likes, dislikes, puzzles and connections. And I've always found that that's a really nice way to have an introduction to any text, but it lends itself perfectly for when you're describing or looking at comics or graphic novels. So we had collaborative child-led open discussions. So the point here was not trying to guess what was in my head as a teacher. It's very much having that sort of dialogic approach where pupils kind of go on learning together. They traditionally, as I've mentioned, had 16 copies within each classroom. So children were able to work a text between two. And due to the nature of this picture book / graphic novel, there's about 16 to 20 pages. So there's lots for them to unpick. Children were making references, constantly turning back and noticing sort of connections, both intertextually, so in between the text and references to the text world, but also intratextually, which is sort of the outside of the world, their own personal experiences. So the piece of writing just at the top there focuses on a really sort of touching moment. We had a discussion just about a soul image, and the choice of the image was up to the child. And in this case, they've mentioned a heartfelt illustration. We'd focused just on the hands and how the hands can sort of say so much. So their writing there was linked to that, saying about savouring the last moment together as a family. And obviously within these texts, there's lots of themes. And I think what's really important is that obviously as practitioners and as graphic novel or comic readers, we know what those themes are. We can sort of draw or sort of hone in on particular features, but there's always things that children will pick out that we haven't thought of. So the middle section and the section on the right both refer to a personal connection. So the boy who wrote the response in the top right hand side was referring to this chart, the man who's just looked up and these origami sort of birds are flying overhead, and it made him relate to his own family and made him think of his own family. And in the bottom right hand corner, there's a sort of a part of a discussion where an elderly soldier, who the children find out about his past, is being sort of introduces the man to his friends. So it's really interesting. Sort of the last comment at the bottom, it says the creatures are just like the men. I believe they're replicating the men's introductions. So they were starting to notice that a bit like Pullman's His Dark Materials, these little creatures sort of are somehow connected in some way to the characters, and they were noticing sort of intertextual links between the two. So yeah, the sort of inference has been really strong, sort of getting them to sort of understand image. And I think on the next slide, there should be a few things that I found as a practitioner. So a big part of this novel, if you know it, is you focus in on this one character, the man, and his introduction to this new world, which is both disorientating and sort of very different. And that's shown to the reader through sort of the language, through his interactions with people in this new sort of city. And what was really interesting is following that character throughout the narrative. One of the boys in my class commented that it was very much like a stop motion film, like they were reading this graphic novel and feeling like it was a film. And I think there's great use of colour in here. It has kind of noir and sort of sepia visuals, and it lends itself. There's flashbacks. There's so many things which would traditionally sort of cover in written text that lend itself to this visual form. And something that when I was putting this presentation together that I thought back to was BFI produced a really amazing set of resources for some films in education many years ago now, but the Interfilm have partnered with that, and they give really good classroom, I suppose, techniques to allow practitioners. So if you're sat there and not feeling confident using within the classroom, there's some really good sort of techniques to use in class to kind of hone in on particular aspects. I won't read both of these introductions. The top right deserves to be read in its entirety, but I'm conscious I'd like to have some time for sort of any questions at the end. But this is just a free writing response. A lot of what we do within schools kind of has to come not necessarily with an objective, but there's always something in mind. And I think it sort of builds on from what both Richard and Helen have said, that kind of individual response and encouraging that personal perspective was really interesting. And so for this particular part, it's towards the end where the man has been reunited with his family, and they could choose to sort of write from a perspective of the daughter or the mother, which was really interesting for the boys in my class. To write from the perspective of a female was really really interesting, and there wasn't any sort of like resistance. It was all one at the bottom is an example of that. I felt devoid of all emotion. When I got out of the transport, I can see my daughter with the same feelings as me. And so that, just as a short paragraph, as a teacher, I can see pathetic fallacy, I can see amazing use of punctuation. But the great thing is, because it's a free piece of writing, there's no objectives that they're having to tick off, and it's linked into our reading. So we're sort of ticking off, and sort of, I guess it's a win-win situation for me as a teacher. Next slide, please, Helen. So what we've been looking at then towards the last part of last year, we had started to look at features, and this is something I'll absolutely say I've cherry-picked from Richard's work, was with graphic novels and how they can be used with grammar. So one of the lessons that Richard kindly sort of blogged about was about using speech. And so graphic novels are not the most traditional form yet, I've put, but I think that they can be. And I think there's a sort of big argument from all three of us to show that they are sort of a very valid and really informative form that we can use within the classroom. So they allow us to focus in on language. There's amazing literature and theory based on the language within graphic novels, and them not being sort of, I hate for them to be described as just for reluctant readers or as a gateway into proper reading. Graphic novels, we do the opposite in sort of our school. We have picture fiction up at year 6. We have graphic novels up in year 6. It's not the sort of the idea to leapfrog into a novel. Graphic novels have their place, and that's in the language that's in there, and they see that both in written and illustrative contexts. Speech was such an interesting one. This is an example from Gareth Hines' Macbeth, and they focused in on the discussion. So we'd looked at the scene using Shakespearean language, and then we looked at how the graphic novel then utilised that. And you can then see not only sort of in terms of speech bubbles, and they're getting an understanding of who's speaking and how much they might speak, but you've then got your square boxes. I'm sure there's a better word that Scott McLeod would give them, but yeah, you have the boxes in terms of the narrative, and so that the children are then able to get an idea of those conventions that these graphic novels use. And then you've got things like punctuation choices. Half of mine love using, I'm sure it's called an interrobang, a question mark and an exclamation mark after one another. It comes from their understanding and love of comics, but obviously you can then focus it on things like inverted commas, ellipses, parentheses. And then I know a few sort of graphic novels that break the fourth wall, tend to be ones that aren't so suitable for a primary audience, but there's the opportunity then to sort of to give children all of these things that they might not have at home. Next slide, please, Helen. So the last two slides focus in on sort of other ways you can use graphic novels within the classroom. So they can be used to look at figurative language, but also for poetry. So in the example on the top right, the children tracked the use of the image of the dagger in the graphic novel version of the text compared to the Shakespearean version. And so it can be seen sort of how the dagger is hidden behind the back, how it's kind of described as sort of like a mirage. So there's lots of value to graphic novels being used alongside sort of traditional texts such as Shakespeare. And then I've just sort of mentioned with a rich graphic novel text, poetry and free writing can be planned in a variety of starting points. So you can use an example at the bottom left, which I haven't used this year, looking at seasons and how time is progressed. And then there's an example here from using the first 9 images in Sean Tan's text, a really beautiful poem, which again is sort of personal. I'd love to read these through, but I'm very conscious of time. Next slide, please, Helen. So this is part of my work when I did work on graphic novels and how they can be used in the classroom. It focused in on the refugee experience, and I think it's really important, especially with something like a wordless text, that children understand and unpick the themes within the graphic novel. So books, picture fiction books especially, give children a kind of a surface level, as kind of an entry point. And so it's really important for us as practitioners and sort of learners to think about giving them the wider picture. So looking at things like Amnesty International and looking at other texts that complement that. And perhaps I think it's really important for us to focus in on authenticity. So looking at something like Omar Mohammad's When Stars Are Scattered is vital. And I think it goes back to that sort of point I made at the first instance about having texts that have that high quality, but also having the practitioner with the knowledge to sort of search out those high quality texts. Next slide, please, Helen. I think that should be my final one, which is the fact that I still learn. I'm constantly learning, not only when I work with graphic novels, but especially so when we're looking at visual texts. And examples in the top right, there's a part in the story where the man is sort of delivering boxes as one of his jobs. And I just kind of, a bit like Richard, just sort of glanced past this. But when we sort of paused and went through, sort of there's little parts, there's a small tiny image with an arrow. And after sort of finding out, we said, oh, this is just like if you have a dog and the dog's in the garden and the postman's gone to the sort of front door. And we noticed, because the man doesn't understand the language and we don't understand the language, we didn't sort of work out that the little sort of symbol in that middle panel is saying like deliveries around the side. So there's so much interesting sort of new noticings that we get from graphic novels, and children make some amazing connections that I'm still constantly surprised by. So the last few points, graphic novels can be used in a variety of ways. They inspire free writing, they develop language, inference particularly, but also when working within the curriculum, we've got to address these content domains. So the national curriculum asks us to look at sort of summarising main ideas, making inferences, predicting, identifying information, and looking sort of for other sources. And I think that they're a sort of an easy win-win, because we're able to map those to graphic novels that work incredibly well. And they engage. There are still some barriers to learning, so I think that it's important to recognise that they're not just going to sort of take those barriers away for some children, but it definitely, in the 3 years that I've been using graphic novels in the classroom, it's definitely made an improvement with those who might sort of find text initially quite challenging. And then the next steps, sort of similar to Richard, we're hoping to sort of open this up then to Key Stage 1. If you don't follow already, I'll do a little plug for Richard Ruddock's Padlet. It's an amazing space. It's where I learn a lot from. And I think having sort of collaborative teachers like Helen and Richard working alongside me has been fantastic. We sort of bounce ideas off one another. We host little graphic novel chats on Twitter, so join in with that. But yeah, it's been a pleasure to talk about it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sort of thinking time-wise. I know we started about 5 minutes or so later than planned, so we were going to have a few questions that I've got for Richard and Rich, but then we'll maybe just have one or two of those and give some time out to the audience if they want to ask any questions as well. But Richard, Ruddock or Rich, Charles, I don't know if you want to answer, which wants to answer this question, but you know, you're both very pro, obviously, using comics in school, that's evident. But we all know that's not the case everywhere. So why do you think some teachers are still reluctant to use comics in the classroom?
Want me to jump in first? I think it's partly sort of the own professional knowledge, but also sort of there's a willingness and a desire, and I think teachers they're very willing to try something, but it's knowing sort of, I suppose, the tools, the ways to teach it, and the worry about teaching it wrong. And I think the great thing with graphic novels is that there isn't really a wrong way to do it. You can give them the text and tell them to read a section of it, and the discussion that just comes from that should naturally give you some amazing stuff to not only sort of necessarily write down, but I think back to something that I'd mentioned about the inter-film resources of the BFI. Film resources and filmic sort of language is really useful to use when you're thinking about graphic novels. You can talk about perspective. You can talk about the idea of a close-up. If it starts, for example, in the arrival, there's the starting on the hands, and then it zooms out on the next panel to the family. But there's so much that you can sort of describe there, and I think it gives you a few resources on there which are really useful. But I think it's just having that desire to sort of go and expand your own professional knowledge. I know there's plenty, Scott McLeod I mentioned, but I know there's Neil Cohn. There's lots of writers who have started to talk about graphic novels and comics and how they can be used. But it equips the teachers with the language which they can then share and impart to their children, really. Richard?
Yeah, just to add to that, there's a really good book come out recently by Shweta Miller, which is like 8 easy ways to use them in the classroom. And the way it works is like, here's how you could do it tomorrow. So it takes away that fear and that kind of, because I think some of it is people are afraid because they don't read them or they're not sure about them. And sometimes you've got, don't want to say it, but there's environments where risk taking isn't always encouraged. So you're like, oh, if I do it and it goes wrong, someone will say, well, why don't you just do what we always do? But her book is brilliant because it gives you some really simple ideas. Not all of them are primary, some of them are more secondary, but it's like, here's how you could do it tomorrow in your classroom and have a go at it. And I think it is just one of those, like, it seems a bit daunting to do something different, or maybe it's not always been done before, but part of being a professional is that you have to keep trying to, develop your own knowledge and develop your own skills. And it's part of that, like, take a risk, see what happens. If it goes horribly wrong, go back to your normal text tomorrow or try it a different way in the future. You can't just hide from it. If I turned around and said, I'm not going to teach using, I don't know, the normal version of Macbeth, if I was doing Macbeth, someone will quite rightfully be annoyed with me, but it should be the same. Like, why wouldn't you use a different resource to try and support you and just see if it benefited the learning, really?
Thank you. I've got one more question for you both. It kind of switches it around a little bit, really, but sometimes I think it's been argued that actually comics are part of children's personal reading, their home reading, and that by teaching them in schools, we're sort of stealing this away from children and ruining comics. What are your thoughts on this?
I'll jump in on that one. I can see the argument. I can appreciate where it comes from. I think looking at my own class and how I've just gone into a class who maybe aren't reading mad. They don't necessarily dislike reading. They're kind of ambiguous towards it. But already there's been lots of children enjoying books and then recommending to friends or sharing that kind of, oh, have you got onto number 6 yet? And although sometimes you do take away some of the individual enjoyment, by using them and praising them and kind of spotlighting them, you also offer that opportunity to have group enjoyment and to have that book discussion and to socialize. Actually, this is a really good series. Like just today, this sounds made up, but it's true. A kid who hadn't really mentioned reading that much to me just came up to me on a break duty and went, I love comics. And I was like, great, that's what I want to hear. And that's because he had been recommended the Spaceboy series by someone. And the other day he was badgering me and moaning at me because I didn't take it home to finish it because he needed the book I was reading. Like, they just offer, it does offer that chance to socially enjoy and explore, and peer recommendations and peer book talk is always the most powerful.
It taps into like the reading for pleasure and that idea of if you can encourage that and not sort of dismiss it and not see comics. I was brought up on Tintin, on Asterix, and was quite privileged, I guess, to see myself or to kind of see myself in comics and in graphic novels. And I think there's such a wealth of different graphic novels that are coming out now that can be used in the classroom. And so it's partly sort of encouraging and having sort of practitioners, anyone who works in schools, to encourage. And I can think of examples where you have people asking for a stapler. And I was like, why do you need a stapler? And they were on the field with a piece of paper, stapling their graphic novel together. And that's where you kind of want to get to. And I think just by having them in the school in the first instance, that will kind of organically grow. But if you get a practitioner who's passionate about it, I think that's really sort of going to be evident that is if it can get into the classroom. I do get the idea of taking some sort of enjoyment away, but I also sort of suggest that by introducing them to this kind of world, some of them might not have had that experience. We're not necessarily going down the assessment route, like the national curriculum route. So having to answer a 2-mark question, as Rich said earlier, we're using these in what I hope are enjoyable and engaging ways. None of what we've talked about here was a forced sort of task or a task that they had to get like certain success criteria from. So having that sort of openness and the sort of dialogue is really important. But if you just get a teacher who uses the graphic novel and then puts a set of 7 questions that they've got to put together, that might then switch them off. So I can see sort of the point of that question is a really good one. But yeah, I hope we've kind of unpicked. We haven't answered it fully, but I hope it's unpicked a fair bit.
It has. Thank you so much, Richard and Rich. I will hand back over to LICAF now, which I can just see a screen of you all. But thank you for having us. If there's any questions now from the audience, please do let us know. I know we're slightly getting close to the end of our time.
can't wait. I'm hoping next year we can get some time off and come and visit. Kendal's a beautiful place. Spent many hours in a hand. There's a beautiful pen shop there where I got lost for a while. But if there's any questions or if you need to move to the next thing, we're absolutely understandable.
Thank you all so much. Absolutely brilliant. And so much evidence of the wonderful stuff happening in classrooms. I mean, so much innovation, so much commitment, so much passion and knowledge. I mean, it's just so heartening to hear. So thank you to the three of you. We don't actually have time or really, I think, the technology to take questions properly today, which means you have to commit to coming next year and hanging out and going back to that pen shop and eating Kendal mint cake and all of that good stuff. So we look forward to seeing you then. Everybody, would you please join me in thanking these three wonderful speakers, Helen, Richard and Rich.
Thank you.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we have about 15 minutes break now. You can stretch your legs again, and we come back to another online session where Natasha from here will be in conversation with Eleni Sampara. Thank you.
There is more coffee outside if anybody needs.
Welcome back after the break. Our penultimate session is focused on comics for inclusive language, sustainability and learning. And it's going to be an interview conducted by Natasha with Eleni Sampara. So Eleni is going to be appearing on Zoom and Natasha is going to be in conversation with her. Please give her a very warm welcome.
Okay, hello, thank you, Andy. So I'm just waiting for the Zoom screen to start. So, hi, hi, Eleni. Hello, can we hear you? Can you just check whether you're unmuted?
Okay.
Oh, yes, brilliant. Yeah, okay. It's working.
Is that
perfectly.
okay?
Yes, we can hear you. And we see you on a big screen. so hello again. And so today I'm in conversation with Eleni, and what it really means is just prompting Eleni to talk about her work. So I would just ask her very few questions, and she will be talking about her work primarily on the project called CL, or Comics for Inclusive English Language Learning, and also in the end she will reflect on her work on developing and researching and illustrating and authoring a biography of Galileo Galilei. So hello Eleni, you are greeting us from Greece. You're in Athens at the moment, yes?
Yes, I am. Yes.
So what's the weather like? You were talking about some...
It's a mess today. Nothing works. I'm very happy that at least I have my internet connection working on, because the metro does not work in nothing. It's a disaster. But here I am,
Here you are indeed. We can actually hear you really well. So hopefully this will be the case, throughout your presentation. So Eleni Sampara is an academic artist. She's based at Acto College in Athens. And Eleni, you can say now more about your work, but I can kickstart the question actually, and I have it here on my little mobile phone device. So the first question is linked to the CL project, of course. So I would just ask you to tell us what was the goal of the project and what did you do, and if you can just comment about those goals, your work, and show us some examples.
Yeah, sure. Well, CL was a collaboration between 4 universities. It was a European project, and the goal was to help English learners like I am, for example, people who they're not native speakers, and especially the ones with learning difficulties like dyslexia, to understand how to structure an essay via comics. We used comics as a medium in order to help them. So that was the intention of, basically that was the intention to help people with learning difficulties,
Yes, and make it more inclusive, because
Exactly, yeah.
the argument was that although it was directed towards dyslexic learners, it was inclusive, so it was for all learners. So we didn't
Yeah,
want to,
exactly, yeah, for sure, yeah.
see exactly
Yeah,
the project
it's
as
not
just
just for them, but we had them in mind, and they gave us a reason, let's say, to focus more on the visuals.
That's right. And would you like to share some of your slides that you prepared,
Yeah,
for us, just
just
to see a couple
let
of.
me. Okay, let me know if I'm sharing anything.
Okay.
I'll try now.
Yes. Now we just see a little image, and something is getting there. Yay! Yes, yes,
Is
brilliant.
that okay? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Would you like to ask me anything else, or for the
Yes,
moment?
what I would now ask you is just to tell us about the process, your own artistic process, and how you worked within the research team, and what you did, for all for the project itself, because you developed a number of really, really engaging and interesting stories that were based on United Nations sustainability goals. And I should just also mention that the project involved 4 European countries. So the countries involved were, the UK, and the project was led by Lancaster University and Dr. Julianne Syme from Educational Research, with a group of other people participating from different from different countries, such as Germany, Cyprus, and Greece. And Eleni can also put that further into the perspective, and what you did, how you actually developed those stories through the comics format, and also had to embed sustainability goals in the stories as well. So if you can talk about that, Eleni.
Yeah, well, look, the thing is that first of all, we have some data. Let's say all designers, when we get to develop a project, the first thing we do is that we collect the data. What I had to collect was, I had the essays, but the essays, they're not stories really. Mostly
Yes.
they are a collection of arguments and stuff like that. And they're not really stories. The classic way we mean the story, that they have a beginning and an end, and they have some characters involved, and these characters do some actions and they're really interesting, etc. Mostly it's about several arguments and opinions, and I think the most what really caused us the most of the problems was that we didn't really have the story in the classic way that we mean it, So in a way we had to create stories, but we had to follow the text meanings as well, and then these are here. I think you see my slideshow. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. The key elements were that, first of all, they had to be educative. They had to propose some new ideas to people and to help them learn something. Then we decided to do them as comics. The format could be digital, and it had to be inclusive. That was the key elements of the project. And there were 2 levels. The first level, let's say, it was the easiest. Let's say. Because the concepts that they were introduced through the essays, they were a little bit less abstract, Mm-hmm. So they were more easy to illustrate, let's say, or at least comics are most of the comics are representative images. So when you talk about, for example, football, you can show a football game, but when you talk about liberty, how can you show liberty, when it's not, yes, when it's an abstract idea, So the first level was, let's say, the easiest, and here you have some examples, For example, we're talking about quality education. So the subject was Agatha Christie, because she had some learning difficulties, and then so she was a good example, for example, here you go with the look of the application, there was an exam question, and then there you have the essay, you know. This was one of the easiest essays for me to illustrate, you know, because I already had a character here, you know, a well-known person, you know, so I could do a research about her, you know, find her home, her furniture, the way she was dressing. Yes, still it was not really a story, but it looked like a story, you know. That was one of the easiest, I think, essays. And then for sure I had to invent some stuff, and I think the most difficult stuff was you know, how to make a story out of this, because out of this opinions or events that the essay was commenting, you know, to make a story that somebody could read, not just as an essay, you know. What helped me was to create some sort of visual metaphors that they're meant to be explanations of the text, you know, but I will show you some examples, you know, but because I think it's not very easy to follow me right now. So here was my narrative structure, you know. There were, like, let's say, 2 levels of meaning. You know, one was the image and the other was the text. So, you know, when I was reading the text, like Agatha at her, you know, despite her learning difficulties, you know, I was showing an image that shows the learning difficulties, you know, dysgraphia, and that was, you know, a visual metaphor, dysgraphia, you know, the visual metaphor, and it was full of, you know, then she was a prolific writer and was known for her 16 detective novels, 14, etc., etc. So here you have several, you know, several words that I had to illustrate, but at the same time I had to create a story, you know. So I had to think about how will I put all this in images, you know. Somebody will be there sitting writing, then he will go away, and then he will put the coat on, and then he will put the hat on, and she will put the hat on while the text will say romance novels, so that in a way the mood and the flowers will represent the word romance, you know, because I didn't want to show literally, you know, the cover of a romance book, you know. So then she wrote some detective stories. So here I saw some extracts of the story, you know, it's not the full comic, you know. So when it was saying detective stories, so say, okay, I will put her, you know, in the tunnel in London Underground, you know, so that everybody can understand the concept of mystery, instead of showing, you know, a detective story, the cover of a book, you know. And then the man standing behind her will be Edgar Allan Poe, because the text was saying that you know, the stories, detective stories, were invented by Edgar Allan Poe, but, you know, how can I put Edgar in my story, you know? So I put him right there at the end of the tunnel, looking at her, standing here behind her, waiting for the train to, so he's looking at her, and he's the man, because he was the inventor, let's say he's the man that arrived first. That's the way I thought about it, you know, and he's looking at her. And but Agatha, because she's the one who revolutionized, you know, murder mysteries, she's the one who, you know, as the train arrives and the doors are opening, she's entering the wagon, and here she is, you know, she left Edgar Allan behind her, you know, who was the inventor, but she was the revolutionary one, you know. So this is the way, with this visual metaphor, I tried to follow the text, you know, exactly what it was saying, but show it in a more metaphoric way, you know, because in a way I had to explain the text. You know, when you create visuals for people who are dyslexic, not only for them, but also for them, one of the goals are to explain them what you want to say, you know, to explain them some concepts, you know. And how can I say that she revolutionized, you know? It's okay, I will put her, you know, entering the wagon with with this with this way of walking, that it's like really like a winner, so that was the way I was thinking about all the essays. How can I show something without really showing it in a literal way, showing it like a metaphor, So here, the story goes on as the essay goes on, and for example, they say that the stories have become firmly rooted in British culture.
Yeah.
So here is everybody wearing clothes like detectives, and there is a dead girl here and in the train, and they all look very suspicious, and then the text says that Agatha could be a role model for all those who struggle with writing, because before the text it was saying that she had some writing problems, and so here she is looking very proud, and she's observing the passenger, smiling as if she knows who the murderer is, in the wagon. So here you have a second story in the story. The essay says one thing, but the story, the visuals say also another story at the same time,
Yes. Can I just jump in, Eleni, just to ask you, just to direct the conversation, because we have roughly about 5 more minutes for the talk.
Yeah, sure.
Yes. So as I understand, so basically the whole process, it was a process of you kind of looking at the essays that you had to illustrate or translate, and now you're sharing with us how you actually did the translation, and this is a very complex work, because you use all of those metaphors and you wanted to present a very layered storytelling, which has this visual layer and also textual. Yes, and that can then used by teachers and can be used in the classroom, where actually students can not just interact with the text, but they can also interact with images as well, and then try to interpret not only the text, the essays, and deal with them, but also look at the images and use those images as triggers for reflections. And I think that's that links really nicely with the previous conversations about using comics in education and in the classroom. So I would just like to wrap this up with saying that the CL app is available and it's free to use, and it's on CL website, and it has been actually used and tested by teachers across schools, and I think in countries such as Greece, Cyprus, Hungary, and the feedback has been really, really overwhelmingly positive in terms of how it supported learners, in terms of structuring essays, understanding the ways how essays work, because a lot of the panels that Eleni was developing were actually following essay structures. So in the app itself, the learners can actually, they have different tasks to put different essay parts in order, or to rearrange particular sentences, which is of course very helpful for dyslexic learners, but it's helpful to all learners. And just a few words, Eleni, about your work on the Galileo project, and just how what kind of impact you think that that can have or had in educational terms, and what kind of change it can make, because obviously the CL comics that you created in collaboration with the team are already doing making that change and having some impact, and that impact is ongoing, as I understand.
Well, yeah, I don't know if art or comics can bring any change, let's say it like that, because that would be easy. The only thing that I hope that they can do is that people can reflect on some ideas, and because the information is out there, it's not anything new. The same goes for Galileo that I did. Everybody knows Galileo, but well, probably they will see it in a different way, or they will see some other information that they never knew about him or about this subject or one or another subject, doesn't matter what the subject is, and they can approach it in a different way, because I don't expect that the people will, their opinion will change about anything, just that they will learn some more and they will search some more information about it.
Yes, a lot of the time, actually, the impact that this type of communication has is exactly the change of opinions or awareness, and that is actually quite a big change, because the change of awareness would then, in the long run, lead to some other changes.
In the long run, in the long run,
exactly.
I don't believe that this will happen immediately,
Yes.
but this can be a start, let's say,
Absolutely.
I learned something new, let's search about this, or let's reflect about it,
Yes.
something like that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Eleni. Would you like to just show us the final slide where people can maybe see a link to Galilei graphic novel that you did, because you did it both in Greek and in English, as I understand?
Yeah, well, could you please, I'm so sorry about this. I was not, had not prepared this. Well, I'm really sorry about this, Natasha. I haven't prepared the slide for Galileo,
You did have a couple of images, as far as I remember. So if you
have them, because I haven't prepared them, so you can share them.
Okay. What we will do, we can just post those images later. I mean, we can definitely post them on,
Sure.
and we can direct actually everyone to the blog that you did for the Reopen network, because there is a blog that Eleni wrote about Galileo's project, and if you're interested in reading about that, then you can check out the Reopen network website if you just write in Google search images Lancaster Reopen. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, that was really great. Thanks a lot, Eleni.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much to Eleni, and thank you to Natasha too, once again, and for keeping things really running nicely on time. We come, believe it or not, to our final session of the day, and we just have a few minutes just to set things up here. The session, intriguingly, is called Comics That Break Boundaries. Dr. Jo Sutcliffe-Sanders will be chairing that discussion, and I think there are two speakers rather than three. They're going to be speaking to us via Zoom this afternoon. So if I can invite Jo down, and hopefully people will be available on Zoom in just a moment. We're early. We're running early. Yep. Extraordinary. It is a miracle. Yep. But over to you, Jo, and please welcome Jo.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Let's see. So as we're bringing the speakers up here, I'll just say thank you very much to LICAF for having us. I've worked with both of these presenters before, and I'm really excited about what they're doing. When LICAF approached me about doing a session, I thought that it would be a really good idea to shine some light on what these scholars are doing, because they're working with Indigenous and Global South comics. These are the areas of research for them. So they're going to be talking about their research. I'm afraid that our third speaker today, Marisol Rodriguez, is not going to be joining us. So we'll just hear from Andrea and then from Nicole as well. So I don't want to introduce them until we're ready. Have we got them up? Yeah? So Nicole and Andrea, can you hear me? I don't hear you if you're responding.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, there's Andrea.
Hi. Yeah.
And there's Nicole. Yeah, great. We've got you on a big screen here at the front of the room. Hello, lovely to see you. All right, great. So my name is Jo Sutcliffe-Sanders. I'm at the University of Cambridge in the Faculty of Education. But the two speakers we have today, what I'll do is I'll introduce one of them, then let her do her presentation. Then I'll introduce the other and let her do her presentation. So we'll start with Andrea. So this is Andrea Aramburu Villavicencio. She holds a Master of Arts in Contemporary Literature, Culture and Theory from King's College London. She holds a bachelor's degree in Hispanic Literature from PUCP in Lima, Peru. She's currently doing her PhD at the Center of Latin American Studies at the University of Cambridge, where she's also a Gates Scholar. Her research looks at feminist and queer approaches to Latin American comics published after 2010. And I'll point out that Andrea and I spend a lot of time together because we're actually putting on a conference together in July, right, Andrea? July? At Cambridge on comics and the global South. So watch this space if you're interested in this. So Andrea, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Joe. I want to share my screen, but I'm still viewing Eleni's screen.
No, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Eleni, if you're there, can you just please stop sharing your screen so that the present speakers can share theirs? Are you there?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to do this. Can you stop it? I thought I did it. I'm very sorry about this.
That's okay, Eleni. We're checking on our side to see if we can
Okay,
do something.
I think I did it. I think I did it.
Oh, well
Okay.
done. Okay, Andrea,
Okay.
you want to give another
Sorry
shot?
for this.
No, that's okay. Don't worry.
Okay, wait. Okay, now I'm going to share mine.
Okay.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
We don't see it yet. Just a moment. We're checking something on our end. Oh, wait a minute. We do see it. It was just super tiny. Okay, we do see it. Yeah, go ahead whenever you're ready, Andrea.
Okay, so it's okay now. Okay, so first of all, thanks to the organizers of LICAF or LICAF, I don't know how to pronounce it, and especially of this section, Comics Up Close. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you, Joe, for organizing it, and really nice to meet you, Nicole, after all those email exchanges. So I won't speak for too long because, I mean, we were initially supposed to be 3 people, but now it's just the 2 of us, so maybe like we have a little bit more time, but it's just like, I hope you can get like an idea of what I have been, a little part of what I have been working on lately. So this is the title of my presentation. It's called Andean Materialities, Intermediality in the Scenes of Silvana Uñas. So to give a bit of context, Silvana Uñas is a young artist from Cusco in Peru, who's not really very well known. Like I came across her scenes in an online scenes fair that normally takes place in Lima, but this edition was just recently held online, called Festival Leme. And what I'm going to talk today a bit is about the idea that comics normally are thought to be inherently intermedial because they bring together image and text. But here I propose to think about how comics can be intermedial beyond just dialoguing with the written text, and that the dichotomy text-image, and that they can actually reference other mediums and materialities. So the scenes of Silvana Uñas, I'll try to show, they expand the notion of writing beyond the written text because they dialogue with other forms of communicating meaning that are not necessarily written text, but they still mean and communicate something that are specifically Andean. So these are the 2 scenes. They are called Dichoso aquel que conoce la hoja de coca and Teñido Natural. The first one dialogues with the coca leaf, and the second one with natural dyes for textiles. So both scenes were self-published by her own editorial project, which is called Koikunakuy Ediciones. And they are handmade, beautifully drawn with fine pen and printed in black and white, with the front and back covers printed on cardstock, and are also carefully tied with woolen threads in green and mauve colors, a characteristic which emphasizes a lot their do-it-yourself aesthetics, as well as the small scale of their production and distribution, which is definitely something that I'd like to talk more about, but I'll just leave it there for this presentation. So, wait. So I'm not gonna say a lot about dichoso aquel que conoce la hoja de coca, but I just want to show how what Uñas is doing in this scene is bringing together two worlds about like that think about materialities in a sort of hybrid manner, but that does not necessarily resolve in a, we could say, in a positive encounter, but it's rather more asymmetrical, but at the same time it continues to be hybrid. So she mixes information from what her grandma would tell her about the coca leaf, and this is emphasized with more drawings and ways that reference corporality and the body with scientific information about the plant. And for instance, here she includes knowledge of the Mama Grande next to knowledge of Hipólito Unanue, who was like a scientific authority on the matter. So this is interesting in the way the scene is constructed, because it actually uses a form which is similar to the medieval herbarium and can have dialogue with other like colonial genres or forms, but she includes sort of generational and orality in the way the coca leaf is represented. So we see a similar hybridity and strategy in Teñido Natural. But I think this scene is especially important, and there are like other important issues that it brings up, particularly regarding the representation of the practice of textiles as an embodied way of writing and being. So I could say like the whole of Uña's scene-making project looks to perform an intermediate dialogue with an Andean epistemology, we could say. The scene, this Teñido Natural, evokes a sort of physicality of sewing. The paper has a texture that evokes a certain textile feeling, and the narrative it constructs pays special attention to how textiles and dyes for textiles have a sort of agency and liveliness. So she talks about how these natural dyes come from plants such as queuña, quincasucho, tara, chilca, coyi, and how these plants have personalidad propia. She's a known personality. She says how these colors have a known personality, and how in general she constructs this ontology, personifying the materials, but also textualizing the weavers. So she's kind of like personifying the whole process and constructing it more in relation. So for instance, if we see this page that I'm showing here on the screen, we can see how she uses a similar medium of hybridization as she does in the coca leaf scene, but she places, she kind of draws her text within a medieval form, but she also includes words in Quechua that say Yinfimanta umanchispi yuyarinanchis, which she translates recuperando nuestras memorias de color, which means recovering our memories of color. So for her, making visible the process of using natural dyes is actually an ethical call to make memory through other means beyond the written, right? She's representing it in this scene through image and text, but she's evoking, referencing another kind of writing, which is the whole process of textile making. And well, this resonates a lot with like what Denise Y. Arnold, an Anglo-Bolivian anthropologist, has theorized about like how textiles embody notions of being, knowledge, and social memory that are beyond Western notions. And then just to finish, the closing page of Teñido Natural is this one that I'm showing on the screen. And it's a drawing of a textile made of patterns and words, both in Quechua and Spanish. And at the top, we find a woman who presumably could be like a tejedora, a weaver, and she stands at the opening of one of the outgoing threads of words and forms, which seems to be emerging in interwoven patterns from her feet, as if it was a river. So, and on top she writes Telkai. So she does not really offer a translation for this specific word, but if we search it online, we can see that it means at the same time to write, to draw, to paint, and to sew simultaneously and non-hierarchically. So I think like as a concept, Kelkai is interesting because it cannot really be contained in its translation to the language of the colonizer, we could say, right? It introduces a sort of Quechua epistemology that encompasses the actions of writing, drawing, painting, and sewing, and that is related to the textiles as much as it is to other ways of expression. So the expansive and sort of like non-definitive nature of this word is actually a concept that cannot be thought apart from its embodiment and the way it like has a context, we could say, right? It can only be grasped in situation or in relations, we could say better. So being non-Andean, me, I'm from Peru, but I'm from the coast, and I also don't speak Quechua. I actually must approach it under what Eduardo Viveiros de Castro calls a controlled equivocation. And this is a quote. He says, we need to recognize that understandings are necessarily not the same, and they are not related to imaginary ways of seeing the world, but to the real worlds that are being seen. So Kelkai, in this sense, is not an untranslatable concept for me, right? Because perhaps for someone who doesn't speak Quechua, they understand it in a different way. But rather it's an intermediate way of knowing, seeing, and being in the world that is mediated in the textile practice, and here also in the scene-making practice, right? So yeah, so the intricacies and nuances of this concept, as I have tried to briefly outline, I think can be extrapolated to the whole of Uña's scene-making project, Desde lo Andino, who, by using scenes to dialogue with materialities that communicate meaning and construct worlds beyond the primarily logocentric. And yeah, I hope I didn't speak for too long. Thanks.
No, you did beautifully. Thank you very much, Andrea. Our second speaker then is Nicole. So this is Nicole Fertado, she, her also. She's a fourth-year PhD student in the English department at the University of California, Riverside. She is of Kanaka Maoli heritage and is from Nanakuli, Hawaii. Her research interests are in speculative fiction, indigenous studies, digital art, disability studies, science and technology studies, and decolonial futurities. She's always been interested in speculative art, especially in graphic novel and comic book form. Nicole's work looks at how indigenous communities create art and comics to express their cultures. Her love of comics originally started from reading Japanese sci-fi manga. This interest has grown since then and still informs her research. And we met first because her dissertation director is a really dear friend of mine who put us in contact with each other. And Nicole came and gave a talk about indigenous comics in Cambridge right before the world fell apart and we couldn't see anybody at all. So I'm really glad to see Nicole again. Nicole, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Aloha mai kako, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone in London. Good morning from Hawaii. I'm so happy to be sharing space with you all. So I'll just jump right in. I have quite a few slides, so we'll just see how far I get through it. But I did just want to I've been working on this for a while, for a couple of years. And so while this doesn't encompass everything that I've been working on in regards to Solomon Enos, I just picked the most interesting parts, I think, to present today. So my presentation is titled Hawaiian Futurism, the work of Solomon Enos. So we're going to primarily be looking at his graphic novel, Polyfantastica. He has, since this came out in 2006, he has a multitude of other works that are related to this universe that he's created in Polyfantastica. So we'll focus on that, and then I'll give you kind of an overview on what his more current things he's been working on. So I'm from Hawaii, and so I just want, for those of you who aren't familiar with the history of Hawaii, I just wanted to give a brief history, even though in no way does this capture everything that happened. But in 1776, Captain Cook arrived, and diseases affected 90% of the population in Hawaii until only 40,000 Hawaiians were alive by the year 1900. In 1893, the Hawaiian monarchy was overthrown. In 1898, Hawaii was illegally annexed to the United States, and in 1959, Hawaii became the 50th state. In the 1970s, there was a Hawaiian cultural renaissance, so a lot of cultural practices and language came back. And in the present time, there are over 500,000 Hawaiians in Hawaii and across the diaspora. So some main ideas in this presentation, and that kind of work through my larger dissertation on the part that involves Solomon Enos, is the work of Kanaka Maoli visionary Solomon Enos envisions the future through Native Hawaiian worldviews, promotes a reconnection to land and oceanic interconnectedness. Enos's speculative comics radically shift cosmological views and humanity's relationship to the planet through reconciling Oiwi, or native relationships to land. So I just wanted to start off with this quote. So Solomon Enos himself, I met him, I think we're friends, I don't know. I've been working on his work and speaking to him for a couple years now. So he said that Polyfantastica is a conceptual project. It's broad, long-ranging ideas tap into the meaning of our, or the role of human beings within the universe, you know? So it's pretty far out kind of stuff. So this is a self-portrait of Solomon Enos. So not only does he work on graphic novels and things like that, he's actually does mixed media, murals, public art. So we can consider him, he's a self-proclaimed radical optimist creating indigenous aesthetics. So he's actually from the same part of the island that I'm from, in Makaha Valley. His artistic expression includes a wide variety of media, so oil paintings, book illustrations, outdoor murals, and mixed media sculptures. Solomon's art expresses his own aspirational vision of the world at its best, which is at times deployed through polyfantastic. So that's kind of his twist on science fiction. He calls it polyfantastic, or science fiction with through a Polynesian aesthetic. And so he creates those kinds of narratives, and his work touches on themes of ancestry and identity, the human relationship with the earth, and the future of Hawaii, its people, and its resources. So two vital concepts to his work is Pan-Pacific solidarity and the symbiotic well-being between land, ocean, and people. So here is the first page of Polyfantastica. So I was really just drawn to his art because of the depth to it, these intricate details, and things like that. So this was what really got me started on thinking through indigenous futurism and wanting to see what people in my community were doing with science fiction, as well as other indigenous communities across the globe. So this is the first page of the graphic novel, and you can actually find it for free online. So it was serialized in a newspaper in Hawaii, and then compiled.
Nicole, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. I'm very sorry to do this. We're actually still stuck on the slide that says Polyfantastica is a conceptual project. But that's not what's happening on your end, right? You're actually able to see the later slides.
I'm further along.
Okay.
Let me try to restart.
Oh, that's a good idea. I was just going to give up. So I'm glad you have any ideas at all.
You never predict what's going to happen with Zoom.
You know, we can actually see a reflection in your glasses. So maybe if you get close enough. No, I'm kidding. Don't worry about it.
Okay, what can you guys see now?
Right now, you are clearly in the share screen mode, but it's just black.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay. I could talk through the rest of the slides.
I think that might be the best path. Yeah, just assume that we can't see the image and just tell us what we're looking at. If you don't mind, though, go ahead and share your screen again, or share your slides again, and we'll keep working on our end and see if we can make it work on this side. But just assume until I tell you otherwise that we can't see it, so you need to tell us what you're looking at.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So I don't know if you remember the beginning, which I had a picture of the comic book, but so the first page, which is actually my favorite, I'll read the text. So it says, Polyfantastica, the galaxy in the year 39,999. There is no conflict here, not anymore. no
Okay,
warfare.
we do
No.
see it now. We do see it now. Sorry.
Yay!
Yeah. Okay. So just go on.
Maybe, I'll just leave it small because maybe when I put it in presentation mode, it kind of messes with it. So yeah, there's no conflict here, not anymore, no warfare, no pestilence or starvation, yet each adult intimately knows them all through a drop of water, through memory. And so there's like a teacher and a student here so this is 39,000 years into the future, right? And so the teacher said, this is the final right, come closer. And then the student says, I'm not sure I'm ready. And the teacher says, no one ever is, not for this, not until it happens. Drink and remember the beginning of the 4 great eras, the beauty and horror of Moana Nui. And so basically in the year 39,999, it's kind of like a utopia, but in order for it to be maintained as a utopia, people have to remember what happened. So through a water drop of memory, the student takes it and is transported back to the first era. So there are 4 in this. So 4 is like a sacred number in Hawaiian culture. So there's just a lot of like weaving of Hawaiian worldviews into this mo'olelo, or which means story. So Hawaiian culture was an oral tradition, right? So a lot of stories are told orally through mo'olelo, but as time has evolved and things like that, the Hawaiian language is written down, and even now in modern, right, we have history and stories and concepts and worldviews represented through comics. So this one, I really liked this first page because in order for there to be peace in the future, everyone must know what happened in the beginning. And so this first era is called Ku, which is after the war god in Hawaii. So basically this first page is stating in the beginning there was war. And so that kind of sets the stage and takes us into what happens in Polyfantastica. And so I like to think of Polyfantastica through what Epili Hau'ofa, so he was a really famous Fijian and Tongan anthropologist. In his book, Our Sea of Islands, he's talking about the real myths and legends and oral traditions of Oceania, right, and the cosmologies of the people. But he states that it becomes evident that they did not conceive of the world in such microscopic proportions. Their universe comprised not only land surfaces, but the surrounding ocean as far as they could traverse and exploit it. The underworld with its fire-controlling and earth-shaking denizens, and the heavens above with their hierarchies of powerful gods and named stars and constellations that people could count on to guide their ways across the seas. Their world was anything but tiny. They thought big and recounted their deeds in epic proportions. So I like thinking about Hau'ofa's work alongside Polyfantastica, because Hau'ofa writes about how we think of Oceania as these small, tiny islands, isolated, that are dependent on importing things. But if we look at the actual traditions and legends and we rethink boundaries with that, oceanic people did not the ocean didn't mean that it was like a boundary they couldn't cross. They traversed the ocean, right? So land not only is subjected to just the island, there are pathways all across. So I included this image of Oceania. So this was all part of their universe, right? Land and ocean. So Hau'ofa states that theirs was a large world in which peoples and cultures moved and mingled, unhindered by boundaries of the kind erected much later by imperial powers. From one island to another, they sailed to trade and to marry, thereby expanding social networks for greater flows of wealth. They traveled to visit relatives in a wide variety of natural and cultural surroundings, to quench their thirst for adventure, and even to fight and dominate. So we see this playing out in Solomon Enos's work of Polyfantastica. So he kind of so we see what Oceania actually looks like, right? But in his universe, in 39,999 and so on, he kind of plays with that, right? He makes that into like a polyfantastic narrative. So it's an indigenous sci-fi narrative that begins with the question, what would have happened if we Native Hawaiians had been discovered? Oh, sorry, I think somebody has to mute their audio. Okay, so if indigenous science fiction is something new to you, I I like to think through it with alongside Grace Dillon's very important formative work to the field. She's Anishinaabe from Canada. And so in Walking the Clouds, she talks about how SF is an equally valid way to renew, recover, and extend First Nations people's voices and traditions. Indigenous science is not just complementary to a perceived Western Enlightenment, but is indeed integral to a refined 21st sensibility. So Indigenous science fiction or Indigenous futurism is about bringing the space of the past to the attention of contemporary readers and to build better futures. So she comes up with this term native slipstream, and I think it definitely can be used to think about Polyfantastica. So native slipstream is sci-fi that infuses stories with time travel, alternate realities, and multiverses, as well as alternative histories. So I won't go into all of Polyfantastica, but just give you some highlights. So the story centers around these different factions of I guess chiefs and families that are searching for this stone, the Ora-ino. So the Ora-ino, I'll just read these slides. So it's a stone that like everyone is trying to get to have power throughout the region. And the stone speaks to the main character and says, but we speak only to serve humans. It is in our nature and how we were made. We know love and hate intimately and how they both fail. What we offer goes beyond. What we offer is a chance to do things differently, to upend what has come before. Over and over again, we offer. It's true that we have created unparalleled warriors, raised great armies, and established as many rulers as we have overthrown. Often this has been labeled as evil or monstrous. So this is the stone speaking of its relationship to humans. So I really like that this is like the central plot point, in so much that the Ora-ino, it's talking about how, what they offer, power, love, knowing love and hate intimately. It goes beyond like Western conceptions of what is good and evil, like that we primarily get right from like the Bible. So like what it's talking about is like, just like how we have to rethink Oceania as a space that is not so confined, we have to rethink our relationships to words like power and good and evil and things like that. And this is just one of my favorite little pictures from Polyfantastica as well, just because like I think this like captures Hawaii. As the stone speaks, it's talking about, and for centuries there was only quietude and joy, not because we projected peace, but because we absorbed hate. And so here it's just like folks picking kalo, which is like a sacred plant in Hawaii, and rainbows. And so if you've ever been to Hawaii, there are rainbows everywhere. So I just like how Solomon Enos like kind of captures that sense. And so this is the final scene. So it actually remains unfinished, Polyfantastica, but since then he's come out with like different things that are related, but the main storyline is unfinished. And so here the Ora-ino absorbs into the main character and Hulama. And so it just ends. But since then, he's just like been pumping out works that are like semi-related to the, hopefully one day he finishes it. But here's some of my final slides. So Solomon Enos is developing aesthetics of Hawaiian futurism. So over here we have this artwork he created. And on this slide, so this is done by a native Hawaiian artist, Herb Kane. So this one represents the traditional regalia that the ali'i or chiefs would wear. And so we can see how Solomon Enos is like infusing tech and making like seeing like, well, okay, well, what would these things look like into the future, right? And so here's another example. So I think, so Solomon Enos is quoted as saying, as the Hawaiians say, the past holds the future. And so like, while it's not a direct translation, there's a proverbial saying or alelo no eau that is kawama mua, kawama hope. So this literally translates to the time in front, it translates to that the only way to go forward is to like look to the past. And so I definitely think that's like a great way to like encompass what like the movement of Indigenous futurisms is, as well as what Solomon Enos is trying to accomplish. So since Polyfantastica, he's come up with other graphic novels, Kamapua and Olopana, as well as Ka'ohele. And so these are based off of real myths and legends of Hawaii. And he's even started to develop like an anime based off of the art style on Studio Ghibli, on another legend called Kamapua'a. So I just really love his art. So mahalo, thank you for listening.
Thank you. All right, wonderful. Thanks so much for that. I think we have 7 or 8 minutes. And now, unfortunately, we aren't set up here to take questions from the audience, so that means I get to ask whatever I want. So thanks so much for this. I really enjoyed both of these presentations. These are super interesting. What I'd like to start with is, Andrea, there's a term that's important to you and your methodology, materialism. And I've noticed this term is really important to this generation of doctoral students. My own students keep using it and seem to find a lot of value in it. So what I'd like you to do, if you don't mind, Andrea, this is not an exam, but it's going to sound like one, is if you would tell us what that word means to your study. And Nicole, I'm going to ask you to respond to what Andrea says, because I'm wondering if this idea of materialism is relevant to what you are trying to do too.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, that's a hard question to explain what materialism means to me, but I guess I take up materialism from various angles. The main one perhaps is, and I think this is definitely relevant to like what Nicole is doing, which is like all this strand of like new materialism that looks at relationship with matter and the earth, and sort of like between human and non-human agents. And that's definitely materialism more as matter, and how we need to think of matter not only as something that has agency by itself in like how the world unfolds, but also as something that is not separate from the human, right? So we need to think of like geology and space as something that has been touched by humans, and colonialism and relationships with land since like multiple transtemporal origins, I guess. So that's one way. And then, but I think like materiality is especially relevant to comics, because although, well, even digital comics have a sort of materiality to them. So that's another way in which I think about materialism, which is in how comics is like inherently like a material medium that we deal with, right? Because it's, well, they're drawn, it's much more material and corporeal than like other mediums, we could say. So, and in this case, with this artist, I'm thinking materialities and materialism as more as other ways of sort of bringing these things together. Like, how can we think of matter for things that are not only nature, but rather like an intersection of nature and culture, but also to think how comics, through their materiality, can sort of create intermediate dialogues with these other materialities.
Yeah,
so yeah, I'm not sure if I've been clear.
No, that was great. I had a definition in my head, and I'm not going to say it because yours was so much richer and better. So very nicely done. Nicole, how about you? To what extent does materialism, thought of the way that Andrea just defined it, to what extent does that feel relevant to what you were trying to do?
Sorry, I just like blanked on the thing I was gonna say, but good thing I wrote it down. So I was like struck, Andrea, by what you were talking about with materialism. One of my mentors, Mark Minch, she like deconstructs materialism from like an indigenous worldview. So I think it's like, in academia, it's like gaining popularity to like talk about issues like the Anthropocene, climate change, things like that, and like giving like material objects, right, more than human non-human objects like this. It's like only now being like, wait, these things are important to think about as like having life, and things like that. But I guess what reminded me about that was that a lot of times like those are like co-opted by like indigenous people and have been thinking about these things from these perspectives, and a lot of times they're like co-opted by other fields and studies. But my mentor has a quote. It's like everyone is like, well, like, you know, we have to save the earth, like rocks have feelings too. And it's like from like their worldview, it's like, but which rocks, you know, like the only specific rocks might have a spiritual. It's not all the rocks. So it's like you have to think about like nuance and context, I think, when it comes to certain things, especially when we're trying to talk about like big issues. And then in terms of comics, I'm just like a visual person. Like even with the speaker before, she was talking about how it's useful to teach folks who are differently abled. And I just think that like with the aspect of the visual, I think that it allows like folks to play with boundaries. Like, yeah, I was even struck by the artist you were talking about and like the concepts that she was illustrating. And I noticed that across different indigenous contexts in which like, you know, there's like, even though I don't understand, like I'm not from your culture, I don't understand it, but like there's a way in which the image gives power and life to these things that may like be unspeakable or untranslatable. And so that's what I really like about the materiality of comics. Like I'm reminded of Edward Glissant's Right to Opacity. So like, even though I don't like know what the history behind the things that the art, like you're talking about, there's like something, there's a feeling to it when I see it. And so I think that comics can be really important in perpetuating cultures in that way.
And I don't know that idea, the right to opacity. What does that mean?
So I think he said it. So Edward Glissant is like a francophone, super important to my work, philosopher. And so like the right to opacity, I think like if you guys look it up, he has like quite a few writings on it, but it's basically like, you know, there's like a need in Western culture to like categorize, understand everything, you know, like everything can be understood. But the right to opacity is saying that even though there's something about a culture that we may not understand, that does, you know, I can still respect it. There are just some things that are untranslatable or unspeakable. And so like that's the right to opacity means that like I see difference and across difference, but like have respect for it.
I guess it's similar to what I said about Eduardo Viveiros de Castro's concept of he calls it equivocation and like controlled equivocation. And I think he actually draws on Glissant's right to opacity. And yeah, it's this idea of how we need to like approach things knowing that there's no way that we are gonna like understand everything, but we shouldn't try to like master things, rather like approach it more like as an encounter with something that we might understand, but we can't understand everything.
That's super interesting. Well,
Marisol de la Cadena also reflects on this a bit. I'm not sure if she knows her, on her book Earth Beings, which also talks about like Andean epistemologies. But and me, I mean, I'm not Andean and I'm from Peru, but I don't speak Quechua. I'm not from Cusco, so I think like it's quite important to like recognize that position, because I'm not gonna like. That's why I think the work of this artist is valuable, because she's not even like, she's not well known. She's just like a young artist that is doing these scenes probably like for a small community of artists. But it's in this kind of works where we can see like not sort of like an exhibition of the culture, but rather like an engaging with her own culture.
Yeah. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you both so much. I've really learned a lot today. Thank you for this presentation. I'm going to turn it back over to Andrew now, shall I?
Yeah, unless you have one more question.
No, I don't. I have another question, but it's so big that I know we can't get through it. So I'm going to show uncharacteristic restraint. Join me, please, thanking our panelists one more time.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. Always a pleasure, and wonderful to get to meet you virtually, Andrea, and everybody in London.
See you soon. Thanks.
Bye.
We're just outside London.
Okay. Nice.
London wishes it was Kendal. Thank you so much. I mean, Joe said he learnt a lot. I certainly learnt so much from listening to the two of you. And to listening to everybody today, I just want to thank all of our contributors. I think there have been 19 speakers. My maths are terrible, so there could have been 32. I've no idea. There was certainly a lot, and it was incredibly rich. People stuck to time. People spoke really eloquently. There were strands that very briefly we might think of bringing together. Joe focused in his kind of laser-like, Viva-like question about materiality and materialism, which I thought was a really good, challenging question, which our speakers answered very well. But that notion of a material, real world and how we define it in different ways in relation to things like mental health, to other forms of health too, to the classroom, to the process of learning, to the process of building a better and more just society, something that always seems perhaps out of reach. We've heard about art and activism. We've heard about the relationship between the local and the global. And what better place to do it than in this beautiful small town where people from around the world, whether virtually or in material terms, appear here. Let's make not too much of a binary between that. I wish you all a wonderful weekend. I'd like to thank a few people. Sorry, this isn't an Oscar speech, but I'd like to thank a few people, notably Richard Foster for organising and producing today. Can we give him a round of applause? He's put in a lot of effort. To our hosts, Lee Caff, Julie Tate in particular, who we've worked with, and to the technical crew who have really been very attentive, and it's been very, very challenging. It's the first time that we've run an event in quite this way. It's wonderful to be back in the real space, but it's been a very enabling thing to be able to invite people who wouldn't otherwise have been able to be here. But let's give everybody, including yourselves, one last warm round of applause. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.